Good morning, Africa. Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to today's newspaper review. We'll start with the Daily Trust newspaper. On the Daily Trust newspaper, making headlines at the front page, we have ICPC clears presidency. You can see the full story on page 4 and page 5 of the Daily Trust newspaper. One of the stories at the upper side of the Daily Trust newspaper: we slept in open space for 6 months, rescued adoptee said. You can see the full story on page 11 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Another story at the upper side of the Daily Trust newspaper: ex-DSS officer remanded over alleged link to Ipob. You can see the full story on page 7 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Another headline, still on the Daily Trust newspaper, at the bottom side, we have Tinubu orders EFCC to unfreeze Osun accounts. You can see the full story on page 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper. And lastly, for the Daily Trust newspaper, we have PSC hands over 50,000 recruits to police for training. You can see the full story on page 7 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Moving away from the Daily Trust newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. Making headline, we have legal luminaries speaks as president stops EFCC. You can see the full story on page 3 and page 5 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. Another story on Nigerian Tribune newspaper, at the upper side, we have Dangote refinery emerges Europe's largest jet fuel supplier, overtakes US. You can see the full story on page 7 of the newspaper of how Dangote's refinery has emerged Europe's largest jet fuel supplier and has overtaken US. Still on the Nigerian Tribune newspaper, another story at the upper side of Nigerian Tribune newspaper: CBN says monetary policies, structural reforms tackling inflation. You can see that full story on page 7 of the same newspaper. Another story on the same newspaper, we have security operatives rescue abducted 5 Ogun students. You can see the full story on page 11 of the newspaper. Another story under health for that newspaper, we have 4 in 10 Nigerian medical students gamble online study. You can see the full story on page 27 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent newspaper, we have Tinubu's EFCC's directive sparks opposition backlash. You can see the full story on page 29 of the Daily Independent newspaper. A story on the Daily Independent newspaper making a catchy headline, we have NCAA, NAMA, AAAU locked in sharing formula rule. You can see the full story on page 6 of that newspaper. At the bottom side of the newspaper, we have IGP urges officers to shape debates on state police. You can see the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. At the upper side of the Daily Independent newspaper, we have Tinubu receives indicating reports against fake PFIPC DG. You can see that full story on page 7 of the Daily Independent newspaper. Another story at the upper side of the Daily Independent newspaper, we have Osun sues EFCC for 2 billion naira over frozen state accounts. You can see the full story on page 6 of the Daily Independent newspaper. And lastly, another catchy story on the Daily Independent newspaper, we have Shettima embarks on first annual leave since assuming office. You can see that full story on page 6 of the Daily Independent newspaper. Moving away from the Daily Independent newspaper to the Vanguard newspaper. Making headlines, we have Tinubu to EFCC, defreeze Osun account. You can see the full story on page 5 of Vanguard newspaper. Still on the Vanguard newspaper, at the upper side, we have how inmates run operations from behind bars. You can see that full story on page 21 of the newspaper. Still on that newspaper, we have inside Lagos warehouse where suspected fake Viagra and omeprazole drugs are repackaged. You can see the full story on page 26 of the Vanguard newspaper. Another story on the Vanguard newspaper, ICPC links 2 more fake agencies to Adeyemi. You can see that full story on page 9 of the newspaper. Under sports, on the Vanguard newspaper, we have NSC owes Super Falcons 40 million naira after Egypt's victory. You can see the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. And lastly, for the Vanguard newspaper, we have we've studied Indian American models. You can see the full story where IGP said we've studied Indian American models. You can see the full story on page 8 of the newspaper. Moving away from the Vanguard newspaper to the Matrix newspaper, we have why I directed EFCC to urgently unfreeze Osun accounts, said by President Tinubu. You can find that full story on page 2 of the Matrix newspaper. And another story at the upper side of the Matrix newspaper, we have NGX market value hits 158 trillion naira as investors' confidence soars. You can find that full story on page 3 of the Matrix newspaper. Still on the Matrix newspaper, we have an interesting story here where Vice President Shettima embarks on 2 weeks leave. You can see that full story on page 3 of the Matrix newspaper. Another story on the Matrix newspaper, we have family denies cancer costs Tope Osoba's deaths. You can see the full story on page 23 of the Matrix newspaper. Still on the Matrix newspaper, we have Nigeria, Canada seal historic air park for direct flights. You can see that full story on page 2 of the Matrix newspaper. Still on the Matrix newspaper, we have Arsenal had broken as Vinicius Jr. Real Madrid agree new 6-year deal. You can see the full story on page 25 of the newspaper. And lastly, for the Matrix newspaper, we have from PFIPC scandal, we have ICPC clears presidency. You can see the full story on page 3 of the newspaper. Moving away from the Matrix newspaper to the Punch newspaper, we have EFCC boss faces public fury as Tinubu reverses order. You can see the full story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. Still on the Punch newspaper, under health, we have Lagos short of 40,000 doctors, said by Sanwo-Olu. You can see the full story on page 6 of the Punch newspaper. Still on the Punch newspaper, we have Tinubu mourns as ex-finance minister Adesun loses husband. You can see the full story on page 29 of the Punch newspaper. Still on the Punch newspaper, we have ICPC report clears presidency, indicates embattled DG. You can see that full story on page 7 of the Punch newspaper. And lastly, for the Punch newspaper, we have PSC releases 50,000 new constables to police for training. You can see that full story on page 29 of the Punch newspaper. Moving away from the Punch newspaper to the Guardian newspaper, we have how poor regulation shields oil firms, harms host communities. You can see that full story on page 4 and page 5 of the Guardian newspaper. A story at the upper side of the newspaper, we have security operatives rescue 5 Ogun police students or your teenager. You can see that full story on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. Still at the upper side of the Guardian newspaper, we have Senate forms over 16 trillion naira fuel subsidy bill in 2021 may summon AGF. You can see that full story on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. Still at the upper side of the Guardian newspaper, we have ICPC uncovers 2 more fake agencies in PFIPC investigation. You can see that full story on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. At the bottom side of the Guardian newspaper, we have relief in Osun as opposition, lawyers and others question EFCC's independence. You can see that full story on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. Still on the Guardian newspaper, we have manufacturers seeks 20% interest rates as funding crisis lingers. You can see that full story on page 8 of the Guardian newspaper. And we move from the Guardian newspaper to the last newspaper for the day, which is the New Telegraph newspaper. We have making headlines: embarrassed, Tinubu directs EFCC to vacate order freezing Osun's accounts. You can see that full story on page 4, 5 and 6 of the New Telegraph newspaper. At the top side of the New Telegraph newspaper, we can see new tax rule threatens Nigerians $92 billion crypto market. You can see that full story on page 4 of the New Telegraph newspaper. Then for the New Telegraph newspaper, at the bottom side, we have hidden body fat may be silently damaging men's fertility. You can see the full story on page 27 of the New Telegraph newspaper. And lastly, for the New Telegraph newspaper, a story making headlines for the New Telegraph newspaper, we have Dangote's refinery outpaces US to remain Europe's top supplier. You can find that full story on page 30 of the New Telegraph newspaper. And we've come to the end of the newspaper review. Happy weekend, and please stay with us for today. Thank you.